very much for joining myself and my colleague, Councillor Richard Samuel, and also to a certain degree, our Chief Executive, Will Godfrey, who is at the very least on the line, although we can't see him at this moment in time. We might be able to get that issue resolved during the course of this webinar. So welcome everybody. This is the first of our response, renewal and recovery conversations, and we're delighted that you're able to join us. Slightly ironically, I'm now being asked to pass over to Will to explain how the webinar is going to work. Is that possible from where you are, Will, or do you want me to pick that up?
It might be best if you can do that, Dina, sorry.
That's okay. Okay, so the way we're going to work this is that we'll be speaking and then we'll intersperse that with some of the questions that you've already sent in, and thank you for doing so. And we will also, assuming we have time, pick up some of those questions that you can be asking as we're speaking, and we can pick those up as we're going through this. I'm sorry if this seems a little bit clunky right now, but unfortunately we've had a bit of a technical hitch which we're trying to work through at this moment in time. Okay, so first and most importantly, I think I'd like to say a massive thank you to everybody that has helped us in our response, and also to everybody who's working with us now for the recovery piece as well. As you can see, there's a huge number of people on this screen, and this isn't everybody. You know, there's a large number of people that we weren't able to put on the screen, some organisations and also some individuals who've been absolutely fantastic. So thank you to everybody. I think one of the things I'd like to stress, and you know, you can see because we've had so many logos of organisations on the screen, that one of the keys to how well we've worked over the last 2.5 months has been collaboration and partnership working. And I think we've learned, you know, I think we knew this beforehand, but we've learned how absolutely critical and vital that sort of working is in times of absolute crisis. And I would just like to say all the work that we've done up to this point actually has helped us and stood us in good state. You know, so some of the work that we've done around the community hub, so the Compassionate Communities Hub, you know, we didn't know we were going to absolutely rely on this, and the work that 3SG had done prior to the crisis breaking. But that collaboration has proved to be an absolute literal lifesaver, I think, at this time. Right, so if I'd like to hand over to Will to perhaps give us a reminder of how much has changed in the last couple of months.
Okay, thanks, Dina. So hopefully people can just see the screen that just sets out the timeline, as I say, for what's happened. So you'll see that back on the 13th of March, we had the first 2 residents involved in North Somerset testing positive coronavirus, and I guess at that point, yeah, you know, people knew that the world was changing, but I still think it was quite difficult to actually predict the exact point we were going to get to. So you can see we then moved to various things happening. So we shut the Rowan baths. Then lockdown officially started from UK government on the 23rd of March, and that's the date upon which we, as a council, also declared a major incident. You'll then see various things that then obviously happened towards the end of March and during April. And I guess as an organisation and as a community, that's when the world changed in the sense of how we were delivering services. So obviously, you know, that's when lockdown commenced, and we were trying to ensure we were still delivering services to our communities. Compassionate Community Hub started on 27th of March, and as Dina's outlined, that's when a huge amount of partners have come together to try to provide the ongoing support. We're very conscious that, you know, we are a democratic organisation trying to make sure we keep that activity going. So, trying to obviously continue to make decision making properly. We during this period, we were also getting an enormous amount of guidance, direction from UK government, particularly around support to businesses, and you'll see some of that timeline that demonstrates the amount of money that we were having to pay out to businesses through the various different support schemes. And then I guess as we were getting through April and into May, you can see that again various pieces of activity coming back on stream. So parks reopening, garden waste collections restarting, and trying to make more preparation for when we were hopefully getting to the point of view where elements of the lockdown were going to be eased. So I guess we're in the time where, in some ways, these are some of the sort of the key messages. I think organisationally, it's probably quite difficult to put up a graph that shows the amount of activity we've had to do over quite a short period of time. What this graph doesn't demonstrate is some of the issues that we've had about increased costs and obviously significant amount of reduced income that we've suffered over that period of time. So I suspect we're now moving towards, we've got the first virtual cabinet meeting next week, and then I think people will obviously be waiting to see what happens in terms of government announcements for any potential further easing of lockdown from the 1st of June. So hopefully that just gives you a few headlines about what's happened in the period since the middle of March, which now seems an awful long time ago, and I guess we've got used to that, our new normal. So we've got out of sort of crisis management, I suppose, and into much more about understanding what our new normal is going to look like.
Thank you, Will.
I think that's.
Hello?
Hello, sorry. That's yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think this has been, it's been quite interesting, and I think Will alluded to the how fast everything has moved over this period of time. So 23rd of March actually does feel like a really long time ago, and so much has changed and so much has moved so quickly. So in the first, I'd like to sort of break this down into maybe three parts. So in the first part of the period of lockdown, everything was moving at a real frenetic pace. Getting our sort of plan up together, making sure that all the pieces were in the right places. And then the second phase was almost like a period of, I suppose, relative calm. That's the sort of period of the new norm. And now we're sort of moving out of that phase and into looking to the future, and that period of recovery and renewal. So I think what would be, I'd like to do now is just to talk a little bit about some of those highs and lows during the past period of time. And certainly I would just like to say, I think the way that the community has really stepped up, I think, is to everybody's credit. People have, really gone above and beyond in whatever capacity they were in to do their bit and to play their part. And this has been expressed quite significantly in the work that the Compassionate Communities Hub has been doing. So the Compassionate Community Hub, if people aren't aware, is a partnership between the CCG, Virgin Care, the council and the voluntary sector. And if you can remember back to the earlier screen, you'll have seen some of those names, some of those key partners up there, some people, everybody from the CAB to Mind to Curo to, as I said, Virgin, and a wide range of other fantastic people. Obviously, I'd say that the lows are going to be the deaths, and every single death is a tragedy. And and is, you know, terribly sad for, you know, the immediate relatives, and also for anybody who is taking care and looking after these people as well. You know, and that was really brought home to me when I visited the Peckham Cemetery and saw all the prepared graves being sort of finished off, and then we had the temporary mortuary come in as well. And I think that really sort of hits home how, you know, how awful this is for some. Luckily, perhaps less here than in other places in the country, but and how we have been so fortunate, I think, as well, that most of those facilities haven't been used or haven't yet been used. Let me see what else. So, Will, can I come back to you now, and can you speak a bit more about what has been the big impacts and changes on the council?
Yes. So I think there may be a couple of slides on this one as well. So just to give you a little bit of sort of practicality, we've had about 1,500 staff working remotely from home each day. So if you think about the fact that we went from a position in middle of March where, you know, people were sort of working at home on a fairly ad hoc basis, actually stepping up to be in a position where we've been doing that routinely pretty much for the whole period since the end of March, has been a real pressure on us organisationally, and you know, but actually we managed that pretty successfully. So that's over half of our staff have been working remotely each day. You can see as well that we've been sending out weekly email updates to people across other communities of Bath, North, Somerset, and you'll see an enormous amount of effort gone into that. Interestingly, obviously, people at home, and maybe they've been clearing out their lofts, etc. So we've had a lot more recycling waste to be collecting since the first week of April. That obviously puts quite a lot of pressure on our services, but you know, it's again on one level a quite positive impact of actually the period that we've been experiencing. And as Dean has alluded to, where we've dealt with over 4,000 calls received by Compassionate Communities Hub. So just some of the practical challenges that we've had to be dealing with. At the same time, and I'm sure you can imagine that certainly at the beginning of this period, we had a lot of staff who were self-isolating, who for one reason or another weren't available to do their work. So we've had to do a lot of redeployment within the organisation. We've had to do a lot of rethinking just some of the way that we actually do our work. So, for instance, you know, everybody was used to coming to the office to execute their activity. Now a lot of that has been done at home. So we've done thousands and thousands of Zoom meetings, Skype calls, and you know, we've learned I think how to deal with that pretty effectively to make sure that we've kept those services going. I think there might be another slide as well on our just a bit more information.
I think we're on the second
slide. So you'll see there that we sent out over 2,000 letters to residents who've been on the official shielded scheme. We've undertaken an enormous amount of support through things like food shopping, collecting medicines, all of that being managed through the Compassionate Communities Hub. There's been, I'm sure you'll have seen nationally a huge issue about the availability of PPE. We've worked very hard with people like University of Bath Spa, IUH, etc., to try to make sure that actually we've been able to support our care homes and others around the provision of PPE. That's an ongoing challenge. It's been quite a difficult one around the supply chain, which again has been a national issue. Certainly early on, there was a really big push from central government about homeless people and making sure that we could ensure that we got people off the streets. And you'll see there that a significant amount of additional households we've temporarily housed. And as I say, we've now paid out I think that figure's actually grown to about £36 million worth of business grants that have been paid out. So again, we've gone from a period where we had no processes to do a lot of these things a month and a half ago to a time when actually, we put all of those things in place. We've got that money out the door. We've tried to do as much as we can to support our communities. And it's very important now that we talk about, the response, but also into the recovery and the renewal, because actually that's the most significant challenge now, how we can keep some of the support going, but how we can also transition to what certainly in the short term will be a very different way still of communities engaging with each other and engaging with the council. And we're in particular very keen to understand how it is we can help businesses to re-establish themselves and the support we can give over the next few weeks and months.
Okay, thank you, Will. And I think it's really important to stress how well local government has risen to this challenge. And I have been very impressed at how swiftly we've been able to go from business as usual into an entirely different entity that is fully targeted at addressing this crisis and helping and supporting the most vulnerable in our communities, and making sure that they are safe, that they have access to medicines and food, and sometimes it's just a case of them needing to have a friendly voice at the end of the phone, just to reassure them that whilst they might be almost entirely isolated, that people are thinking of them and they are not in reality entirely alone. Okay, so I think actually now might be a good time to take some questions. I think there was one which was about the Compassionate Communities Hub. This is from Les Redwood from Citizens Advice of Bath and North East Somerset. Obviously, as I said before, Citizens Advice is one of the has been one of the key players within the Compassionate Communities Hub, and his question is that Citizens Advice Baines has been one of the key supporters of the Compassionate Communities Hub, along with Virgin Care and the Council and Bath and North East Somerset 3SG, as well as other charities such as Bath Mind and DHI. This work has been going on for over a year now, and we would be interested in hearing the panel's view of the Hub and whether the panel feels that the Hub should continue post-COVID-19. Well, I just want you to know that I was at the Hub today, and in fact I was actually able to express my views on the future for the Hub this afternoon. I can absolutely see the benefits of having the Hub for the future. I think it has proven how useful it is to be able to work with a range of partners across a broad spectrum that collectively can cover a wide variety of need. They operate a fantastic triage system, so somebody rings in and they are very swiftly directed to the appropriate pod, which then has the experts within it to fully help and address whatever the issue is that they're presented with. So that's sort of my view. I don't know if Will has something that he'd like to add to that at this moment.
Yeah, so I've been to visit the Hub as well, Dean, and like yourself, I think it's an amazing example of actually how people can come together to work in partnership. And in some ways, it's a shame that it's taken something like this crisis to actually bring that to the fore. But I absolutely agree with you that we should do whatever we can to ensure we can actually keep that activity going, because I think it has absolutely demonstrated that different people can come together with different interests and different starting points, but actually we've created a very efficient support mechanism that I think has provided a very different type of support to our communities. So certainly I think trying to make sure that we continue that is something that we should absolutely put as a priority.
Absolutely, and I understand that it is, well, as far as I'm aware, quite unique in the country. Richard, I don't know if you have a view on the Compassionate Community Hub?
Well, all I'd say is I think what it's shown that the wrapping services around individuals with different organisations contributing to that is a very good model for the future. And so instead of services being provided by individual organisations, often to suit their own bureaucracies, this is a new model of service delivery, and I think it's certainly worth looking at for a longer term future than just this immediate crisis.
Absolutely. I think focusing on a whole person and not on operating in silos, is clearly something that we need to ensure for the future. I'm just thinking if I saw another question, which is not about. Okay. Which actually I think is something that you might want to pick up actually, Richard, which is how many of our 48 homeless households are rough sleepers? I don't know if you have the answer to that, Richard.
I would think the majority of them will be. The numbers of rough sleepers varies anyway from day to day and from week to week. And I think when we were asked by the government to house everybody we could find in a very short period of time, at very short notice, I think initially, from memory, we housed around 33 people, but I think that number has risen since then. Perhaps the important thing to say about that is our intention is that people who have been housed in this way do not go back on the streets and do not have to go back on the streets, because what this has shown all over the country is that the thousands of rough sleepers that are out there can actually be housed and taken off the streets. And I think everybody I've spoken to has seen that as a really positive thing. It's more complicated than that, of course, for individuals, because the reasons people are often rough sleeping are very complex. And so just housing them doesn't necessarily fix their problems. But it's a great step forward, and we certainly intend to ensure that those people who wish to stay in permanent housing do so after this crisis is over.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, I'm just going to add a couple of other questions which are directly about council services. So there was one which is about recycling centres, and this is from Jane Evans, the chair of Rithington Action Group. And the question is that 2 recycling centres are not due to reopen, which is likely to lead to an increase in fly tipping. How is Baines planning to make sure residents are able to recycle items which are not eligible for curbside collection? Perhaps, Richard, you would like to start answering that question.
Well, the council already has a pretty comprehensive curbside collection system for recyclables, more so than many other councils, actually. So that's the starting point. It is possible for residents to put out other items for collection. For example, if there is waste that is containable in black bags, our staff will take those, preferably on the days that black bin waste is collected. And also we have reintroduced bulky waste service, so if people have got really bulky items, they can do that. Green waste, of course, reopened as a service a few weeks ago. And so what we're hoping is that there won't be that many instances where people have to use the recycling centre to take stuff. I mean, the typical usage at this time of year is very heavily weighted towards green waste, and people can buy green waste bags. There are various outlets where they can do that. And we are going to have to institute a system at Keynsham to ensure that the recycling centre doesn't get overloaded. So I hope people will bear with us in this. This is not quite reopening all the services completely, but it's pretty well there. And I think it should also be acknowledged that the waste and recycling staff have done a fantastic job during this crisis. Many councils found that it was a struggle to keep those services going, but we managed to do that. And it's a fantastic tribute to the staff who work on that service that they did that. And I know that their efforts were really well received by residents.
Yes, thank you, Richard. And just to re-emphasise, the reason why we've not opened all of our recycling centres is first and foremost for both staff and for residents' safety, because if we can't ensure social distancing and we can't ensure that everybody remains safe, we would be failing in our duty of care towards everybody. So, that has to be our first priority. And I'd just like to stress that if you do have waste, if at all possible, can you keep it at home for now, and please only come to the waste and recycling centre if you really must. So thank you for that. Will, did you have anything else to add to the comments that Richard and I have given?
No, I think that was fine. I think you covered all of the issues there. Clearly we understand that people want to go to the recycling centres, and UK government were very clear they wanted them to be reopened, and hopefully people will use them responsibly over the next few weeks.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, and one thing just to remind everybody, to double check whether, if you are going to the waste and recycling centre, make sure you've got the right car registration number, because we're doing it in an odds and evens on different days. So just make sure you check before you leave home on that one. Okay, so I think what we'll go to now is to have a look at, sorry, I'm just quickly scrolling through where we need to be. So now as we move into recovery, we need to identify what we can continue. So Will, I think this is a good opening for you then to talk about, as we move into recovery, how we can identify what we will be able to continue.
Yeah, so we get probably every day a raft of guidance from the UK government about what we should be trying to do, what we should be trying to bring back on stream. And I think certainly everybody's waiting, I think, for what will happen for the next announcement from the Prime Minister about the next sort of unlocking of activity. But certainly from our perspective, as you said, we've throughout all this period we've kept our key environmental services going, waste management, etc. And I guess the really big issue that we've got to deal with now is how we manage social distancing. So there are a lot of conversations going on around how we manage that, particularly in town and city centres. Also, this is a really big opportunity to do something about embedding walking and cycling across our communities and across our towns and cities. And again, that's something that there's a lot of activity that's going on around that. I think it's also important to say that we're trying to do a lot of work to understand and support the care homes. So care homes is still an area where there's quite a lot of pressure in terms of managing the current system. So again, giving as much support as possible to care homes is a very significant part of what we're trying to do. We will also be in a position from the 1st of June where we will be re-establishing a lot of our activity around registration. So I think we've got about 1,000 births in the period from lockdown that we haven't actually been able to register. So a lot of those services will be reopening again over the next couple of weeks. So I would just urge people to keep an eye on our website and all of our other channels of communication to ensure that actually you see what we will be reopening in a phased approach, so that people in communities can obviously start to access those services again. Thank
you. Okay, so the next section we're going to be talking about is about the finances, because obviously, we're acutely aware of the impact on lockdown on our local businesses, but it's also had a massive impact on our own finances as well. So I'd like to now hand over to Richard to talk a bit about this challenge. Don't know whether you're still on mute, Richard.
Okay. Right. Okay. Sorry about that. We'll get used to this in the end, I expect. Yeah, I just wanted to start by putting in the context here, because nationally we have had to spend an enormous amount of money, and it's worth just briefly saying a little bit about the national spending position, because it gives you an idea why we locally are also facing big problems. So today the government announced that the highest ever monthly figure for UK borrowing, £62 billion. And that is leading probably to overall expenditure borrowing this year of £298 billion, 5 times the estimate the government provided in the February budget. So we can see that this pandemic is going to have a massive economic implication, and that kind of takes me to the local position. So in my cabinet role, I'm responsible for resources at the council, but also our property and commercial assets. And I want to talk a little bit about both, because they feed into our overall position. So I'm going to say something a bit odd to start with, which is that if this crisis had hit in a December, so in other words, 3/4 of the way through a financial year, this would be catastrophic. It would be absolutely unmanageable, and all over the country, local councils would be faced right at the end of their financial years with enormous costs that they could simply not accommodate. I'm not saying it's any better that it's come at the beginning of a financial year, but at least that gives a chance for the council to try and manage the situation as best it can. But let's just run through quickly what has happened to the council. As Will referred to earlier, we had to close the Roman bath and the pump room very early on. That meant the income simply disappeared overnight. And we estimate that that is going to lose the council £17 million income in this current financial year. We are not optimistic that we will be able to reopen the baths and the pump room much during this coming financial year. We think that whatever happens, there will be restrictions on numbers, and so the income will not return to anything like it has been in the previous decade. We have lost parking income because clearly people have not been driving. We suspended parking charges right at the beginning to be helpful, and we reckon that's going to lose us just under £7 million this year. The commercial estate I referred to, so this is the retail properties the council is the landlord for, and other commercial properties. We are now beginning to see a growing clamour from those tenants to either set aside their rent or defer payments of rent or come to different terms. And I'm afraid to say we also have some tenants who have simply stopped paying without telling us. So a very difficult position there. We're currently estimating another £6.5 million loss from that. And then there are other smaller areas of lost income, such as planning fees, which have reduced dramatically. Well, all of that adds up to around 33 million. We are spending more on the COVID work, as Dina and Will have described. And then we are also expecting to see losses in council tax income. We were given extra money by the government early on to support the poorest households with council tax payments, but that is only provided assistance to around 4,500 households. So we are expecting that many council taxpayers will stop paying because they can't pay. So when you add all of that up, that's a bill of around 50 million. So far, the council has received around 10 million pounds from the government in emergency funding. And you can see that leaves a massive gap of 40 million pounds that has to be dealt with this year. The councils have to balance the books annually. So we cannot carry a deficit of 40 million pounds into future years. We have to deal with it in year. And that's posing us an enormous problem. Our starting point is to talk to the government, to talk to local government officials in central government, and the leader and chief executive have been doing that. We've been speaking to both local MPs, and we have been lobbying our case. What we have found is that in work that we have done to research our position relative to other councils, is that we found that Bath North East Somerset is probably near the top of councils that is the most reliant on income it generates itself. Going back a decade or so, central government started to remove grants from local government and gave encouragement to local government to fill the gap by raising their own income. We have been very successful at doing that, and unfortunately that success now is a massive weakness because the sources of income that we have grown have suddenly been hit very badly by the government's decisions to close the economy down. So it's a difficult situation. We're working at the moment to put together plans that will come before the council in June and July. And what I have to say is it is inevitable there will be some impact on local people's services. And we will obviously do everything we can to minimize that, but I'm afraid it's not a happy position. So we wait to see whether the government will meet the losses that we and other councils have experienced, but we're not there yet by a long way.
Thank you, Richard. I think it's a very, very sobering position to be in, isn't it? I have a question here from Karen Walker, representing, in this instance, the Somer Valley Forum, and it's about the contingency fund. Well, actually, the question is, does Baines have a contingency fund in place for emergencies such as terrorist attacks, pandemics, wars, etc.? And if it does have a contingency fund in place, how much is in the fund?
Well, the simple answer is yes. And in a normal year, the contingency reserves that we have, revenue reserves they're called, would be sufficient to deal with one-off events that are short-lasting. So, you know, the events quoted, a terrorist attack or something like that, or the collapse of a roadway or some short-term problem like that, can be dealt with within the reserves the council's got. We have several different types of reserves. We have a general reserve that is available to deal with any eventuality, and this year that stands at 13.5 million. And then we have what's called earmarked reserves. Those are reserves that are allocated to particular services. So an example of that would be we have a reserve that is available for children's services. And the reason we do that is that the demand for services for children with special needs varies. And sometimes it's necessary to draw on that reserve to balance the budget. So, you know, there are reserves for specific purposes like that. In total, our revenue reserves add up to 30 million. So you can see that the current financial position that we face will wipe out the reserves unless we do something. And we cannot go into the next financial year with no reserve. It is simply not possible to run a local authority with no reserves because things always happen. And I think if there's anything we're learning from this coronavirus pandemic, it is that it is not going to go away quickly. There may be recurrences, there may be future lockdowns. The effect on the economy will be long lasting and it will take a long time for things to fully recover. So I think we have to be realistic and realize that we are going to have to make sure that our reserves are resilient for the future. So it's quite a difficult problem. It's not one that's easily soluble, I'm afraid.
Well, we've got two other questions about the budget. And one is from Martin Grissoni, I think, which is how much have you considered borrowing to make up the shortfall? And the second question, which is from Paul Rolls, which is, with the budget tight before COVID-19, where do you envisage cuts coming from?
Well, local authorities can't borrow their way out of this sort of problem. Borrowing money to prop up reserves is not really a viable solution in local government finances. So we're not able to do that. What we can do, as far as borrowing is concerned, and we don't use borrowing to fund day-to-day services. What we do is we use borrowing to fund capital projects, particularly where those capital projects are investments or they bring forward income for the future. And the only borrowing we do to support day-to-day services is the sort of lending, inter-authority lending and inter-bank lending that we do to manage our money the best. So we don't borrow money simply we won't be borrowing money to get out of this problem, and nor will any other council, because it's madness to do that, really. Sorry, the other question was from Paul Rawls, wasn't it, about cuts?
Yeah, it's about whether or not we'd identified any cuts.
Well, what is going on at the moment is that the council's finance team and directors are looking all the way through our budgets to identify how on earth we might meet this gap. And we haven't got conclusions about that. Those findings are due to be shared with the Cabinet next week, and we will begin to get an idea of what's possible. I haven't got anything I can say on that tonight because I haven't seen the proposals that are coming forward from the Council's directors, but we will know in the coming weeks what those are, and when we're able to announce them, we will.
Okay, so I've got one more question actually, which is about the reserves, which is, do you recall what the level of reserves were when we took over in last May? That's again from Martin Grissoni.
They're higher because the council managed to, under our stewardship, the council managed to balance the books this year. It did not overspend, and we have been able to return some money into reserves this year. So the reserves figure this year will be higher than it was when we took office.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Okay, so now I've got a few questions about, for specifically about business. But actually, before I ask those questions, many businesses have been able to receive grants. Many businesses have been able to furlough staff. So I've got sort of two questions, both from, let me just check who they're both from. So both again from Martin Grissoni, which are we allowed to furlough staff, and have we done so? Perhaps that question actually could be directed to Will.
Yeah. So in terms of the organisation, we are allowed to furlough staff, and we have furloughed staff. We're only allowed to furlough staff that are funded from income that we raise. So we're not allowed to furlough our sort of base staff who are funded through government grant. So we are doing that where possible. I just wonder if I can just to also add a little bit to what Richard was saying to begin with, which is that our financial framework is set by government policy and by government legislation. So whereas other businesses would be able to go out and get an overdraft and borrow money to actually sustain their ongoing business, we're not allowed to do that. So we're also, unlike the NHS, who are allowed to run deficits. Local authorities are not allowed to run deficits. We have to balance our budgets year on year, which is why the current circumstance puts so much pressure into the system. So, you know, unfortunately, we have to deal with the rules that we've got. We're not able to actually change that in the short term.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for that extra bit of clarification there. So I have a question now, which is around discretionary grants, and that's from Chris Head. So has the council set its policy yet for the discretionary grants fund, and in particular in relation to charities? I think that's something for you, Richard.
Well, the answer to that is yes, we have, and the decision was published today. The scheme will come into effect next Wednesday, and we are opening up for applications over the next 2 weeks after that. Our team have there have been a lot of businesses who have come to us for support and found that they fell just outside the very tight parameters that the government set for the business grants schemes. And we have been keeping a record of all of those, so that when we come to open that scheme next week, we will immediately be able to make contact with those businesses who have already been in touch with us. We have found in this process actually that there is some very hard luck if you fall just outside the rules. I mean, for example, I had one business who I spoke to who were just outside, they had 2 properties in Bath. One was just outside the rateable value limit, and so they were not entitled to any assistance at all. And the other business fell within it, but they were only entitled to a small amount of money. And of course, for the business, they're running an integrated business with both premises involved in that business. So to them, it seemed very unfair that we weren't able to support them. And we've also come across other instances where this is going to be put right now. The government initially insisted that you had to be registered for business rates to be eligible for the scheme. And we discovered as we went through this that some guest houses in the city had been forced to register for council tax by the valuation agency, thus taking them outside the scheme. And we're reintroducing a category in the scheme next week, which will enable those guest houses to apply for assistance. And these are traditional guest houses, of which we've got many in the city and in North East Somerset. So we have been able to tailor our scheme to the businesses that we've been seeing just falling outside the government scheme. But it is undoubtedly the case that not all businesses will get assistance. The last thing I'd say on that is one of the things Bath is very proud of is the high level of independent businesses, small independent businesses. And we have done everything we can in the scheme to direct assistance to those smaller independent businesses, because they're the lifeblood of a city like this. And we'll see how we get on with that. We will publish the figures when we've got through the money available. But just bear in mind, just to finish on this point, it is only just over £2 million that's available. So that isn't going to go very far, but every bit helps, I guess.
Thank you, Richard. Very helpful. Okay, so I'm moving on now to recovery and renewal. And I think actually it'd be quite a good way to start this section by talking perhaps to this question, which has been asked by Nicolette Bota. The question is, the virus is also exposing and multiplying environmental and economic inequalities that have been around for a long time in our locality. What will the council do to mitigate this escalation in its economic recovery planning? And I think that fits really well with the, what we are proposing to do, in the near future and also for the longer term future. Obviously, in the near future, we need to be putting in measures that help people maintain social distancing. But, in the sort of from then onwards, I think we need to learn to be less dependent on mass tourism, but also working to ensure that our economic recovery is as green as it possibly can be. So I'm actually going to bring Will in a bit to talk about the opportunities and the discussions that's already ongoing with our businesses, because I think this is is something that I think you would like to know more about.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. So I think it's really important to emphasise from the beginning that this isn't just the job of the council. It isn't just the job of local government or national government. I think everybody's going to have to play their part. Certainly, I think we're very conscious that this recovery will be driven, I think, from a very local base. So working together and thinking about opportunities and absolutely moving away from what is a large sector that's probably quite that's going to be proved to be quite vulnerable around retail, about tourism, etc., and actually to try to promote and support some of our smaller businesses, particularly in the creative digital industry, where perhaps we can drive different types of opportunities and actually think about Bath and Somerset in a slightly different way. I think it's a real sort of opportunity for us to think that through. So we've already established a new economic partnership, which has got representatives from across the different sectors of the economy, across both Bath and North East Somerset. And we've had one session of that. We've got another session next week. And that's just one example, I think, of how we're trying to work together across all of our communities to think of different ways to actually renew the economy and to think of different ways to bring further opportunities to all of our communities. And hopefully that's something that everybody will engage with. And we want to have further conversations over the next few weeks and months to ensure that everybody is working together and we've got a good idea of where we think those opportunities lie.
Yeah, Richard, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that? I've got a couple of questions I'd also like to throw in at this point too.
Well, I think the big unknown at the moment is what damage this pandemic is going to do to the local economy. We can speculate about that at the moment, and I think many businesses I've spoken to are just hanging on as much as they can. What we don't know yet is the extent to which there will be business failure, and to some extent that will determine what we do next. But I think we are expecting to be quite a high rate of attrition in the hospitality sector. We know that there will be some small independent businesses that simply can't survive because the cash flow isn't there. So I think what we don't know at the moment is what's that going to look like, and it's probably a little bit too early to try and second guess that. I think maybe in about 6 weeks to 2 months we will have a clearer idea, firstly what's happening in terms of containment of the virus, but also we'll get a better sense of what's going to happen to businesses. I mean, in some ways the government is aiming in some ways at August, at the point at which things will start to get released. We will expect some announcement next week or so about what is going to happen. The same will happen in July. This is going to be something we won't know completely until close to the time. And that's going to be the case for businesses. And it's quite hard at the moment to look ahead for more than three months at the most. You can't really get a sense of that. So I think we're watching it very closely. Our business team is keeping a very close contact with the business community in the city, particularly. And bearing in mind that I'm not trying to be too Bath-centric about this, but Bath is a major employment area for people surrounding Bath. So a lot of people in North East Somerset work in Bath, but also we're mindful of looking at what happens in Keynsham and Midsummer Norton, which are also local employment spots. So I can't completely answer the question at the moment, but I think in a few months we'll be a little bit clearer about what we're facing.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So there's two questions I've got. One is from Roger Driver, which is, have you determined dates on which decisions will need to be made on things like the Christmas market, or whether they will happen or not, and need to be scaled down?
Well, I understand a decision will have to be made about the Christmas market in June or July at the very latest. The difficulty with, and again, this is very difficult to look into the future. if social distancing restrictions exist in November and December, then it will not be possible to hold the market in the way that it has been in the past. Because anybody who has been to the Christmas market knows that it's very dense when in the areas where the stalls are. And although it might be possible, I guess, to reduce the number of stalls or extend the separation, you can see that there would be an enormous management problem in terms of trying to accommodate previous numbers. So I think it's something we will have to wait for another month or so before we come to a decision on that. And it comes back to the speed at which the government releases the lockdown. And I think this is a little bit confused at the moment in terms of it not being very clear, perhaps for quite understandable reasons, how mass gatherings can take place. And I would put the Christmas market in the mass gatherings category, really.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. So a few more questions, particularly actually around community-based and greener tourism. So again, from Nicolette Boter. I think actually that's probably the end of another question, which is about the Economic Recovery Partnership and the work that is doing to ensure services can continue. So maybe it's just a comment, perhaps, because we've only got a few more minutes left today, about the new types of attractions that we might be able to consider, or an offer that we might be able to have around Bath and North East Somerset for the future.
What I don't think is going to happen quickly is that people are going to get onto aeroplanes to come halfway around the world to visit another country. I think air travel will be very different in the future. I suspect a lot of people are going to avoid flying for a period of time. So that component of our tourism economy may not return quickly. I certainly don't think it'll return this year. It may start to return a bit next year. We don't know. But reductions in one area of tourism could possibly lead to other opportunities. And it is perfectly clear that many people in the UK this year are going to stay at home, and they're going to go to places where they can that are safe to visit. It's possible that Bath North East Somerset might be one of those areas. But I think that the idea of people coming in big coach parties linked to international travel, I think that is probably not likely to happen this year or into next year. So I think we're going to see a much slower return to that market. On the other hand, the space and distancing in the city does enable people to see its true beauty. So I think that the absence of traffic, the absence of lots of coaches, has generally been seen by people as a very positive thing. So I guess we'll have to see, but I don't think the local economy will bounce back that quickly this year. I think this is going to be a tough year.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Richard. I'm really sorry, everybody, but we're now coming into the last minute of this particular webinar. I hope you found this to be useful and possibly even enjoyable. I am aware there's a number of questions that we haven't been able to answer, so I apologise for that. We will endeavour to get answers to you. We will also be having more of these webinars over the course of the next few weeks and months, and also just very, very quickly rush through one of the last questions, which was from Jane Evans about democratic processes. And I just want you to be assured that we are trying to get back to normal decision making as quickly as possible. And obviously you may have seen, I think a couple of weeks ago, we had our first virtual planning meeting. And next week, we're going to have a number of other meetings. We have our council AGM, our resources PDS, and also culminating in a cabinet meeting on Friday at 2 p.m. So I hope to see some of you there, and thank you very much for your time and for sending us the questions. So thank you from myself, from Richard Samuel, and also for Will Godfrey. So thank you very much, and good night.
Good night.
Good night.